First, it could be useful to get into your sort of theory with John Vervaeke on the Big Five and what changes you've made. I mean, I think it could be helpful first off to sort of just say like more broadly, what is the Big Five? Where did it come from in the first place? How's it work? And then
Yeah, excellent. So let's take that up. So in order to understand what the inactivist Big Five theory of personality is, EB5T, we got to first understand what CB5T is, the cybernetic Big Five theory of personality, which comes from the work of Colin DeYoung. And in order to understand that, we need to start with where you just suggested we start, which is the Big Five itself. So the Big Five, in the broadest sense, is a descriptive theory or account or model, rather, of personality that basically says that there are 5 broad domains along which we can describe people in terms of their styles of behavior, habits, and ways of being in the world, with themselves, with others, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the 5 traits, hence the Big Five, right? The 5 traits, you can easily remember them with the acronym OCEAN or canoe. Either one works. Let's go with OCEAN for now. Openness to experience and ideas, that's the first trait. Conscientiousness, that's the second trait. Extroversion, agreeableness, and then neuroticism. Those are the 5 traits. Now, just to outline the logic of how this came to be and why there's 5 traits and not more or less, even though it's that's not a. There are ways of taking this up as in a way where there's like 6 traits instead of 5, but the consensus I think at this point is that it's broadly just 5 traits at the very bottom of it. So if I ask you, let's say, to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy you tend to be overall, looking back at the maybe like last 5 years of your life. And if you say 8, then if I ask you how sad you tend to be on a scale of 1 to 10, looking back at the last 5-10 years of your life, then you're most likely not also going to say 8. You're probably going to say something like 2 or 3, maybe 4. On the other hand, if I ask you then to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 as to how excitable or enthusiastic or positive or optimistic you tend to be, after you've said 8 on the happiness question, you're likely also going to rate yourself high on these scales with those questions. And so what we notice emerging spontaneously in a very empirical and sort of open fashion is a sense of regularity in the ways in which you're likely to describe yourself across time along various different dimensions. Meaning that there's something non-arbitrary going on along these descriptive dimensions when you apply all of them to a single person, that when you subject all these different descriptors and their ratings to various statistical procedures, what you find is that you generally need 5 factors, 5 general factors, the Big Five, to explain and to predict how people are likely going to rate themselves along other dimensions as well. So how you measure on trait conscientiousness or trait extroversion, which relates to the questions I was just asking you or trying to illustrate with, right? How you measure on trait extroversion is going to be predictive of how you see yourself along the dimensions of like excitement, gregariousness, enthusiasm, assertiveness, and there are many, many others as well. And so that's sort of the relationship between each of the 5 factors and the lower order traits that they sort of subsume.
Okay, so we can keep going on that. Can I jump in and ask a question there? So if I'm understanding it, like we have people rate themselves, right, or be rated based on say just words, right, different criteria, and you do statistical analysis. So are you basically seeing whether basically some words, some characterizations are basically irrelevant, right? And so am I right in saying that we have only five, we have the big five, because you keep trying to see kind of what ways you could rate someone just turn out to be irrelevant. They correlated with something else, in which case you end up having five, and you could call them anything, but you end up just having five fundamental things. Something like that. On the right track.
Something like that. I do want to clear though that no theory of personality, including the big five, is an exhaustive theory of personhood. And so,
Right.
like, if you look at the protocols and let's say rules and steps that they took in devising the procedures by which the big five were eventually produced, one of the things they did was so they started by looking through dictionaries and making a long list of all the possible descriptors they could find. And then there were exclusion and inclusion criteria that they subjected this list to. One of the exclusion criteria was if a trait has some sort of moral value, um, like great, for example, calling someone great, we're going to exclude it from the list. And so there are different dimensions of human experience, like the moral dimension, that might not necessarily be captured in the Big Five model, though it might factor in somehow in some ways, but those parts, they were kind of left out deliberately. And so, yeah.
Is that related to like the big six and like sadism, masochism? Like they are things you could rate someone on, but they're not of the same kind of type as like the big five would rate people on. Does that make sense? Or
let me clarify this as well. So the five-factor structure has been replicated independently, as far as I know, with different samples and different starting points, so to speak, when the approach has been broadly empirical. What that means is that we're going to take a look at the data without coming in with any presuppositions, any preconceived notions as to what we're going to find. So concepts, notions that we have, like sadism or masochism or I don't know, like depression or anxiety. Those things we're gonna keep out of this as we subject these lists of descriptors to the statistical analyses that we're going to subject them to. So bringing those preconceived notions in, that changes the approach from a purely empirical one to what we call a rational approach. Rational meaning that you've got principles and preconceived notions already guiding and informing how you see and interpret the data in front of you. So the way the Big Five were made was by adopting as purely an empirical approach as possible. Whereas there are all sorts of other valid personality tests and questionnaires that were derived on a rational approach instead.
Okay, I see.
There are correlations between some of the other rationally-based tests and the Big Five, but the fundamental approach is different, if that makes sense. So
awesome. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I hope that makes sense.
Okay. And okay, so that's cool. So why don't we I think we have a good idea then. Why don't we go then into the five traits, and as well, I guess, the two compartments of each, and then that can thread us into sort of your sort of update to this theory.
Sure. Yeah. And just a couple of clarification points before we move on to what exactly the traits themselves are. I want to clarify that there's an important distinction that we make use of in trait theory between traits and states. This is very important for understanding what traits even are, what the Big Five really even concerns or pertains to, and what it doesn't. So imagine this. We are turning on Google Earth or Google Maps, and we're going to track your location across time on the map. And we're going to represent the pathways that you take in real life on the map by tracing a black line on those points on the map. Now imagine this, right? That we're tracing your pathways on the map, not just across the next day or week, but across maybe the next year of your life. It's easy to imagine that some regions of the map are going to eventually become darkly shaded, densely and darkly shaded. Like your house, which is where you spend quite a bit of your time, or your workplace, or the grocery store that's nearby, or whatever. There are some regions that are going to be less densely shaded in, like maybe some restaurants or towns outside of the city that you're in, assuming you live in a city, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's going to be regions in the map that are going to be like not shaded at all. So you've got this distribution, this density distribution beginning to form based on the pathways that you typically take, based on life and who you are and what you do, et cetera, et cetera. Now what I can do, once that year has passed and all these regions have been shaded in the ways that they are, what I can do is take that map, look at the density distributions of your pathways, and then I could use that map. I can refer to what's on the map to predict with a relative degree of accuracy where you're most likely to be found at any given point in time. Now, this isn't going to mean that I can predict with 100% accuracy where you're going to be, but I've got a good map in front of me. I can predict with a degree of accuracy, right, where you're going to be. And so this is a metaphor for what are Big Five test scores, which are represented in percentiles, right, indicating where you lie on a spectrum, on a bell curve relative to everybody else that's part of that population. This is a metaphor for how we use those test scores to make sense of how a person tends to be. The 5 trait measures are the densely distributed regions of your psychic world where you're most likely to be found across longer time scales. At any given point in time, the particular states that you're going to inhabit, which are acts or processes or behaviors that occur on very short moment-to-moment time scales, right, as opposed to long month or year-to-year time scales. The particular states might actually lie outside of those density distributions, the darkly shaded parts, what the traits indicate. But in other words, what your traits are don't define you in an absolute sense, but they just say this is how you're most likely to be most of the time, normally. So that's the relationship between states and traits and
I see.
Purpose of these measures.
That's a helpful caveat, and as well helpful in terms of pinpointing precisely sort of what your theory does and doesn't say. So, okay, awesome. Why don't you go on?
Yeah. So essentially, how the Big Five model was used right from the start was as a way of demonstrating that certain ratings of one's own self are predictive of certain patterns of behavior, cognition, emotion, motivation. And each of the Big Five represents a qualitatively distinct dimension of trait-like behaviors. So trait openness, let's go through ocean again. Trait openness essentially describes and predicts how when you are confronted with situations and experiences, are you going to engage with them at the level of ideas, like possibilities, the imagination? Are you going to think outside of the box? Is it going to be an aesthetic sort of experience for you? Are you going to be heady? Are you going to abstract out from the particulars, the concrete? Or are you going to be more conventionally minded as you approach the task? So people who are high in trait openness, they tend to inhabit the world of ideas and the imagination. People who are low in trait openness, they tend to be very concrete in their thinking styles and processes. And they tend to be more, down to earth and more concrete. So you can imagine, and let me make one tiny claim here that will be very important later on when we're discussing CB5T and EB5T, that how high or low you score on any of the 5 traits, it's not going to be good or bad intrinsically. If you're high in trait openness, that makes you well fitted for contexts where thinking outside of the box and engaging creatively with information is rewarded. Contexts where, let's say, you're trying to do science and you're trying to invent new ideas or new approaches, things like that, or where you're trying to create art. Right? It's all about a certain kind of novelty that takes place and is created at the level of ideas and the imagination and experience. But if you're very high in trait openness, then working a procedural job, like, I don't know, like a managerial position, for example, or even being like a clerk at a store or whatnot, where all that's required of you is to just repeat more or less the same set of steps over and over again, despite the particulars of the context, you're probably going to be out of place in a context like that. Your approach might itself become problematic in some unforeseen ways or foreseeable ways.
Right. That's helpful. So, and maybe in like John Vervaeke's terminology, we can talk about like agent arena sort of relationships. It's sort of always related to your environment. Well, as well, like to the degree to which you're doing in jobs, right? And it's not an absolute thing. It's kind of relative to your situation and right. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're starting to sort of bring in the theme of person-situation interaction, and how traits are actually, based on this account, they're descriptions or they're thematizations of styles of person-situation interaction or agent arena relationships. And the idea here, and we'll get to this too, the evolutionary significance and necessity for individual differences. The idea is that you want diversity in terms of there being a number of different styles, so that there can be different kinds of fit that can be possible to achieve or realize in case the context changes and different forms of problem solving are required. You want there to be individual differences in traits because people will be able to differentially adapt to the changing contextual needs and demands in a way that might allow the group as a whole to survive and to adapt.
Right. Let me qualify my statement, right? Yes. So it's about actually on a population level, right? It makes sense, and we actually want these varieties of different traits, right? Okay. Perfect. Did you want to? So you were talking about openness. Do you want to go over, say, the 5 traits? Is that reasonable, or should we like? Do you want to do that? Okay.
Let's do that briefly.
Sure. Yeah.
What I do here is outline the logic of the trade-off.
That'll be more useful. But we could just like briefly talk about, because people could look up the traits if they need to,
sure.
Specifically. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll talk about the traits along with the trade-offs that are implicated there, right?
Perfect.
So finishing off with the first trait, openness. If you're low on trait openness, then you're probably going to find yourself out of fit or out of at a mismatch with situations where creativity is what's rewarded and expected. So like you'll probably be at a disadvantage if you're low on trait openness and you are working at a I don't know, like in an art studio, for example, and trying to do art. And the idea here is that there's a place in the world for you, no matter what your trait measures are, because there are certain situations where your trait predispositions will allow you to find good fit based on what's required of you from the context. And there are certain situations where you'll lose fit or you'll experience a mismatch. So that was trait openness. Trait conscientiousness, essentially, as I see it, it's a thematization of our styles of relating with things like time and space and work and effort. So if you're high in trait conscientiousness, you tend to live in the future. You tend to plan and prepare a lot for future goals. You are good at pursuing and focusing on long-term goals, goals that exist 5 years from now on, for example. You like to be punctual. You like to be very rule-bound because that keeps chaos at bay. If you're low on trait conscientiousness, you tend to live in the moment. You are more easygoing when it comes to right. You're less rigid. You're more go with the flow, and you kill yourself less over things not going your way or sudden things popping up that require you to change course and alter course. And you're much more likely to care about what's in the present than in the future. There's like an attentional thing that goes on there where things that it's the marshmallow in front of you that entices you much more powerfully to go after it than the marshmallow, the second marshmallow that might come after if you just wait right now. Should I move on to extroversion next, or did you want to?
No, you can move on. Perfect.
Yeah, extroversion. So let's actually do extroversion and neuroticism next together.
Sure.
It's useful to understand them because there's a kind of relevance realization, opponent processing dynamic that actually takes place between the two. So any organism, if it's going to survive or have a good chance at surviving in the world, what it has to be able to do is to detect and sense possible rewards in the environment that it can pursue in order to secure for itself, and B, detect any threats that exist in this environment so that it can either avoid them or eliminate them. So trait extroversion, as we've come to see it through both CB5T and EB5T, is an adaptation to the problem of reward and opportunity seeking. Trait neuroticism is an adaptation to the problem of threat detection and resolving the problem of threat, let's say, either through avoidance or anger, let's say, aggression. So people who are high in trait extroversion, they tend to be very opportunistic. They tend to be very sensitive to possible rewards that exist in their world. If you are high in extroversion and you find out that there's a party happening later tonight, your immediate response is going to be, oh, that sounds interesting. I wonder who's going to be there. That uncertainty of what's going to happen if I go and explore, it entices you, it interests you, it grips you. It makes you want to go out and check it out. There's that approach, that activation, right, that happens very spontaneously and intrinsically. If you're low on trait extroversion, your response is going to be like, yeah, that sounds all fine, but like I don't care that much. Like, fine, that's good, but I'm not moved by it in the same way. And what this means is that in contexts where the risks are high, it's people who are more introverted who will probably benefit by mere virtue of the fact that they'll end up exposing themselves less to risks that are associated with seeking opportunities. But if the risks are low, then extroverts will benefit more because they will be innately incentivized to go after what they find to be attractive, and there won't be that many risks along the way.
That's helpful that you clarified that, because it's like a real relation to the world, right? So actually, like in one circumstance, it's adaptive to be more extroverted, but then in another sense, actually, you might be exposing yourself to sort of unnecessary risks. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So whereas, as I already said, extroversion is an adaptation to the reward dimension of the human world and human experience, neuroticism is an adaptation to what's threatening, what's dangerous, what's harmful. And so if you're high in trait neuroticism, your concern is, and let me actually give you the technical definition here that comes from CB5T, Collins' work. It's the idea that neuroticism refers to your threshold for how much uncertainty you can take before your defense systems kick into place and take over. So like uncertainty, that's sort of the thing that's part and parcel of this entire system of understanding, where if you're making predictions about how things are going to go and you've got a lot of uncertainty in the situation, you can't make good predictions. That means you can't predict whether things will go your way or not. So now, by default, there's a bifurcation that happens in the value of uncertainty. It can be either good, right, promising, or bad, perilous, threatening.
Mm-hmm.
So extroversion is an adaptation to, right, it predisposes us, it tilts us, our cognition, emotion, motivation, all that stuff, toward the promising aspects of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
We see uncertainty as opportunity. Neuroticism is about seeing uncertainty as danger. And so if you're high in neuroticism, you need little things to not go your way by surprise for you to feel put off and to feel like something is wrong. That shows up in the form of anxiety, in the form of anger, in the form of vulnerability, like not knowing what to do and freezing. That's the freeze response, by the way. And all sorts of things that essentially make you behave in ways in the world and respond to the world in a way that takes into account the possible threats that are there. Whether what's warranted is avoidance or aggression, right, to eliminate, or freeze, just to wait it out.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're high on neuroticism, you're probably going to be the first to notice things that actually go wrong in the world when your world is actually rife with threat and dangerous things.
Mm-hmm.
But if whereas somebody who's low is going to miss, right, commit false negatives here, false negative errors.
Yeah.
And in the reverse scenario, if you're high on neuroticism, but the world is relatively stable, you're going to be finding things as unstable, as lacking stability, when in fact it might be excessive. And so there's that trade-off again that emerges between high versus low.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's it's also it's kind of a question, kind of just a point, like with extroversion and neuroticism, it kind of interests me that it sometimes feels like why are they not just the same trait? You know, are they not opposite ends? But in a way, we're being more specific and saying like actually they're two kind of in a way different ways of responding to uncertainty, and then you could differ on either of them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, like it gets really interesting when you get somebody who's not just high in neuroticism and low on extroversion, or high on extroversion and low on neuroticism, but somebody who's low on both or high on both.
That's interesting you say that, because I noticed I've been trying to think a lot about this theory. I've been noticing it saying friends. I'm like, I'm pretty sure they're high in both, and I'm like, but is it kind of weird and counterintuitive? Like, does that even make sense? But you're saying it does.
So imagine the world of so let's actually go through trait agreeableness, which is I think the last one that's left.
Yeah, yeah.
And then talk about the world of a lawyer.
Sure.
As a case illustration, right?
Sure.
So trait agreeableness is essentially individual differences on this trait. They reflect individual differences in our styles of prioritizing our point of view and our goals and needs, and others' points of view and needs and goals. So if you're high on trait agreeableness, others are the center of your world. You are for them in some sense. You don't like conflict. You like to maintain the peace and the harmony that's there. If you have the choice between avoiding a conflict by smoothing things over, or stating what you believe to be true at the risk of creating conflict or enabling it, you will, all things considered, opt for the former, to just smooth things over, to avoid the conflict, to keep the peace. If you're low on trait agreeableness, it's like, I don't care as much about whether this causes a problem for us or for you. I'm going to say things as they are. At the pathological end, disagreeableness can be seen as not just callousness, but like hard-mindedness, roughness or whatever, but as like being selfish and egocentric and uncaring towards other, unsympathetic, not compassionate, right? But the trade-off that's there is that if I'm very agreeable, and if I'm surrounded by people who aren't, then I'm just gonna get exploited and taken advantage of. But if I'm disagreeable, then I will bring about harm and injury to the relationships that I have. that might not be necessary at all. It might be excessive. And so again, you see a basic kind of trade-off emerging there between high versus low scoring. So I thought, so here's what we can do. I can a moment ago I was thinking I could give the example of the lawyer, and the world of the lawyer, the world that the typical lawyer has to contend with, to illustrate how you can have something like high extroversion and neuroticism and low agreeableness actually being rewarded. But I also want to be mindful of time and see like how you want to prioritize things here. So let's try together.
Well, how long do you have from now would be reasonable?
About like 40 more minutes. How's that sound?
40. Okay. I think a lawyer is cool, and you talked about like, so you're saying low agreeableness, high neuroticism, high extroversion. It's like a kind of a constellation of traits. Is that what we're pointing to? Like that people can have these like different. Yeah.
So let's actually, instead of starting with the traits and moving into the world, let's start with the world and then reverse engineering the kind of trait profile that would need to be in place for a good match.
Sure.
So if you're a lawyer, working at a high performing firm, let's say, something like that, what you are tasked with is lots of so first of all, you're surrounded by sharks, like, right? A lot of this is about power. It's about being able to make your case and put your foot down and not move it no matter what. And in some scenarios, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, we're not talking about the moral dimension here. We're talking about the functional sort of adaptive dimension, right? There are problems to be solved, and then there's competition between members of the group for solving these problems, both within and between law firms, let's say. And you need to solve your problem and do it in such a way that allows you to protect yourself or defend yourself against or incoming, right, assaults by way of argument or whatnot. So you need, if you have high agreeableness, if you're very agreeable, you'll likely make way and yield more than you're supposed to in situations like that. So one thing you probably need is low agreeableness, to be able to not be easily moved to pity, but to focus on solving the problem and making your case, arguing for it no matter what. You probably, so depending on whether it's common law or what the system is, but like let's work with common law, where everything moves by precedent, right? And you need to follow rules, and you need to be able to metabolize vast amounts of information in short periods of time. So something like intellect is very much needed, where you could do a lot of abstract, high-level problem solving in short periods of time. So there's some sort of demand for higher trait openness measures. But too much openness means that you're thinking maybe too much outside of the box, and then you might be led astray and get distracted.
I see.
So there's a conflict or tension there. You need to be goal-oriented. So like extroversion is, in some sense, let me put it like this. I wouldn't be surprised if a lawyer came in and did a Big Five test and they turned out to be very high on trait extroversion, right? Very power-driven, assertive, goal-oriented, and also high on trait neuroticism, very sensitive to threats and things that can go wrong, in order to manage their way and their space and their time and so with as little trouble as possible. It's a very high-stress job precisely because of this, by the way. And the conscientiousness bit, which is that I have to be, like, this is a little tough because, like, you both need to be very on the go, because all sorts of spontaneous problems are going to emerge along the way that will require you to change course and direction. Like if you get a sudden call from a client needing something done ASAP and that wasn't agreed upon, and if you're too late or delayed in getting back to them, then you might lose the job opportunity, the customer, to another firm that's able to get to it faster than you. So it's a certain kind of conscientiousness that's adapted to tending to both short-term immediate needs as they arise and the urgency with which they require to be taken care of, as well as the long-term sort of trajectory of moving towards a goal that might take like a case that might take 3 years to build and to argue for.
Would you say would you say there's something like you have to be both like industrious and orderly, like strong on both aspects of conscientiousness, or what kind of?
Yeah, I'm very much like speculating right now, just imaginatively, because
Sure.
like if you're too orderly, that's going to be very tough and stressful on you because there's a lot of like spontaneous emergent disorder that you have to work through on a daily basis, maybe on even an hourly basis when you're working at a high-level law firm, for example.
Right.
And so that's going to distress you because that's a lot of things going wrong every single moment, and you want things to not go wrong because you need stability. So I don't know what the optimal profile would be, but like these are some of the trade-offs that.
Oh, but that's helpful. That kind of answers my question. Okay, cool. So is this something you so this is helpful to see how the different traits would work in like a real life scenario. I'm wondering what we want to do now. We've uncovered the sort of theory in broad terms. Do we want to look at yours specifically with the different selective and enabling within the traits themselves, or what would you like to do?
Yeah, you know what? Maybe briefly, let's go over how this relates to relevance realization and activism, because this is an enactivist theory of personality. And so I'll say this, that what Colin de Young's contribution to this literature was that we took and built our theory on was that for a long time, the Big Five model, it was a descriptive and predictive account. It was not explanatory. And so the question came up as to what the functions of these traits are and how they even evolved as adaptations, let's say. So that's the set of questions that Colin answered and has been answering through CB5T. And we already went over that, right? That extroversion is about reward, neuroticism about threat, conscientiousness about something like time and work and space and orderliness. Agreeableness about self versus other needs, and openness about open-mindedness, like outside of the box thinking, creativity versus conventional mindedness, things like that. The way we worked with this and situated in the relevance realization framework and in the enactivist literature was by saying that essentially what your trait measures are reflections of the kinds of grip with the world, the kinds of optimal grip that you're predisposed to having or to enacting. That was step one. That, right, how you measure isn't going to be good or bad internally or inherently, intrinsically, but only in relation to the kinds of contexts that you're in, how well there's a fit between what the context is demanding and requiring of you and how your traits are predisposing you to function, so to speak. That's the relevance realization bit, because when you think about optimal gripping, you have to think about it in terms of opponent processing, that there's a trade-off being fulfilled. And we went over those trade-offs along the 5 major traits. There is such a thing as being too high or too low on extroversion when you're in certain contexts that require something else. And so you can think of this as a kind of opponent processing relationship that's taking place whereby your trait measures are, let's say, quantitative representations of the kind of optimization that's actually taking place at the level of your personality with respect to that opponent processing that's happening. So, for example, there's a set of mechanisms that if it's activated, is going to heighten and excite your defense systems, let's say, the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? That system. And there's a set of mechanisms that actually dampens that response and lowers it, right? We've got a basic component processing process happening. So the idea here is that there's got to be some sort of baseline that you have, that you're at. How easily are your defense systems usually triggered, and how high do they go up, and how long does it take for them to go back down, right? Whatever your baseline for those things is going to make you predisposed and optimally fitted to certain kinds of contexts. And the assumption here is that you're not going to be living life in a way where your context and the contextual demands are always going to be changing. You're going to find yourself in a world that's relatively stable, such that the demands with which you're faced are also going to be relatively stable. And so the idea of traits, I think, is that the baseline that they give you is there as an optimization to certain kinds of worlds across longer timescales. Does the logic of that make
Yes. If I sort of say in my own words, in the theory of relevance realization, it's a moment by moment basis of the way in which we're sort of adapting and coming to grips with what's going on, right? But in this sense, actually in longer time horizons, the world is less changeable than in like my moment to moment. And so actually we then want to adapt to that and have a kind of stickiness to where we are. And is that right?
That's absolutely right. Thanks so much for making that connection there in those precise
Right.
terms. This is a matter of time scale. So EB5T, it's essentially theory of the kind of relevance realization that's taking place across longer timescales rather than moment-to-moment timescales. And this leads us to the second implication of EB5T, that as far as I know, no other theory of personality to date has really talked about. This is the phenomenological dimension, the experiential dimension of traits. So the phenomenological turn that's initiated through EB5T says that individual differences in trait measures are actually reflective of differences in how we enact, experience, and participate in the worlds that we're in.
Will I be right in saying then it's something like say you're high in extroversion? It's not that you respond to the world in a way in which you see opportunity, but like the world is full of opportunity in a way it's like it is salient to you, that opportunity, such that it kind of is different to someone high in extroversion versus low. Would that be right?
Yeah, in a very, like, from a first personal sense, your world
Right.
literally is filled with opportunity. That's what you see. And the idea here is that the seeing that's happening there, it's not actually an objective seeing of like looking at your room and seeing objects there that are there before you're being there in some sense, even though they aren't, but we don't need to get into those ontological issues. Here it's more like my traits, my personality is such that it lends itself to enacting the world in these as filled with opportunity, as
I
filled,
see.
and that enaction happens pre-verbally, pre-consciously. That's the pre-linguistic, pre-conscious, pre-verbal, involuntary level of like relevance realization taking place there. But we experience it as objective reality, that because for us that is what it is. So a lot of the time, just a quick illustration here, if in a couple setting you have somebody who's very high in extroversion and somebody who's very low in extroversion, actually let's take conscientiousness as the example for that. That's even more fun. When one of the partners is very much concerned with like keeping things neat and orderly, and they walk into a room in their house that's full of like objects and clutter, if they walk into that room with their partner who is low on conscientiousness, and that partner doesn't get immediately distressed because they're not seeing things that are out of place that need to be brought back into order.
Mm-hmm.
The first partner is going to be like, what is wrong with you? Why are you ignoring my needs? You literally don't
Mm-hmm.
care about what any of this is and like how it's affecting me. You're making me do all the work. When in
Mm-hmm.
fact, nobody's making anybody do all the work. These are individual differences, and they just haven't yet realized that
Mm-hmm.
this matter of not rational argumentation as to who's right and who's wrong, or who cares, who doesn't, but it's a matter of perceptual differences that arise as a matter of these, as a function of these individual differences in trait conscientiousness, for example.
Uh-huh. Oh, that was a cool thing that you brought up, yeah, because that's making me think that, like, actually fundamentally, say in this couple, one person is actually seeing the world differently because to them, the mess isn't relevant to them as mess necessarily. It's actually a reasonable amount of a mess, and so it's not like a problem for them. Right. Okay.
And yeah, so I think that really illustrates the point that uh, trait measures or individual differences on these traits uh, find expression at the level of perception itself in people and their lives. And like, for example, with a couple of that sort, the task typically ends up entailing getting them to a point where they can first recognize that these are different points of view that are involuntary. That's just how the person is, as a precondition for them coming together and deciding how to synergistically relate to one another, almost in an opponent processing fashion, to turn, right, to shift from a relationship of antagonism and adversarial processing, as John calls it, to
Mm-hmm.
a mode of opponent processing where optimization is taking place in a context-sensitive fashion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Um, Thanks for that. So, I mean, we could go into the specifics of, so that's really helpful. I mean, that kind of outlines a lot of your of the bit of the cybernetic theory and then your theory. I wonder if it's if you want to go into like the specifics of it in terms of the trade-offs within one trait, or whether you would like to like look at, like, it was really interesting to think about the different trade-offs like in a population level and the different fit between people in the world. We could also look at like applying, you talked about applying personality to the clinic room and how one would actually again think about fit. And so you said, it could be cool to do actually on my own personality. So I don't know what you'd want to do.
Yeah, good question. Let's touch. I say let's touch on um, the question of career choice, and then the question of culture and personality.
Hmm.
Brief, and then maybe let's, if you're willing to
Hmm.
go over your traits together, and then to see um, an application of this approach, like in real time, also as a way
Yeah.
of demonstrating to the audience how this
Yeah.
they might go about it themselves if
Mm.
they like, not as a clinical task, but as an exploratory
Yeah.
exercise,
Yeah.
as a way of deepening your understanding of yourself as you exist along the longer time scales.
That seems like a cool direction. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
So, okay. So go on.
No, please, please.
No, no, I mean, so we're gonna start with career choice, and you talked about Laura a bit. So yeah.
Yeah. I guess the information um, that's, I think, relevant here to consider is just the fact that, again, how you score on any of these measures, if you complete a test like this online, like the one that I invited you to complete, it's the IPIP Neo. It's a comprehensive, this is just some information for the audience.
Yeah. I'll put it up for the people. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. It's a 300 question long test that you can complete online for free that uh, essentially gives you a breakdown of your trait measures along the 5 major dimensions. And it gives you a more refined level as well, where each of the big 5 traits itself breaks down into 6 lower order traits or facets, which then allow you to sort of look more like closely at the dynamics that are taking place in each trait,
Hmm.
and how that plays out on the global level. So the idea here is that once you do that kind of test and you get your trait breakdowns, then you could start thinking about like what your needs are at the level of your traits. Because like if you're very high in trait extroversion, but let's say very low on trait agreeableness, what that means is that you really like to be around people, which is what extroversion is about. And you really like to preserve your own point of view and your own needs, get priority, even when you're with people, maybe especially when you're with people. And so that can get you to think of like, you have some people who, right, with a combination of those kinds of traits, you could imagine a certain kind of tension that might arise where you might think to yourself that I really want to be around people, but then like no matter where I go, I feel like I'm picking fights, or others are disappointed in me, or they want things of me that I don't want to give. So am I social or anti-social? What? And it's like you're kind of both in some sense, because you really like to be around people, which is what extroversion is about. Whereas agreeableness is about actually liking people and prioritizing them over your own self. And so if you're low on agreeableness but high in extroversion, that means that you like to be around people, but you're going to sort of do your own thing in some sense. And contexts in which that's not probably good, we can imagine some together right now if you want.
Sure.
Like a kindergarten, for example. If you're if you really enjoy spending time with, or like a classroom, you really enjoy spending time with kids, but then you're like the asshole teacher who like is very strict, for example. Not that you should or shouldn't be strict or whatnot. People might experience you as calloused.
Right.
I know. Can you think of any scenarios where that could be a good fit, and scenarios where it can't?
Yeah. I mean, maybe like being a doctor. I don't know. I mean, I guess your patients aren't really people, but like that you were interacting with socially, you kind of, but perhaps, because maybe you're kind of like, look, I'm the doctor here, and so my judgment goes, and maybe that's helpful.
That's a great example, I think. Yeah, or like an entrepreneur, for
All
example.
right. Yeah.
Where you're really goal oriented, but you're going to fight for what you want. And that'll allow you to pursue your goals even when other people cause you trouble, for example.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And so you see how the logic of trade-offs and context sensitivity starts to show itself here as we consider whether a person scores high or low on certain traits. And then like a way to do this that's more targeted and focused is actually by starting with your context, and then starting by considering like, what are some of the things that I feel like I keep running into that are kind of problems for me, that lead me to feel confused or distressed or whatnot, that I can't seem to break out of as patterns, and how might my traits actually be implicated in that?
Yeah, you mentioned this when I did the test to think about it, and I was thinking about it a bit before you said that, and I'm like, oh yeah, now I kind of increasingly seeing, kind of even having like intuition about what's going on. But yeah, okay. So that's a cool plan. Yeah. So
What are you thinking?
right. So you were talking about trade-offs. So like, do we want to do it like say on my own personality? Would that be helpful? Since you've given like some trade-offs there, like extroversion, agreeableness, or
Yeah, we
extroversion,
could.
neuroticism.
Whatever you're comfortable with
Do you think
sharing.
that? Yeah. I mean, if you think that would be helpful, yeah, because I think that'd be cool myself personally.
Let's
Yeah.
do it. Yep, let's do it.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Okay.
We can talk about the culture stuff at the very end, let's say.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Um, I can bring up my chase with people if they want. I'll put that here. But I don't know. Like, what do we like? Like broadly, it was kind of if you looked at it, okay, it was like medium extroversion, I think. Highish neuroticism, pretty high, very high, I guess, openness, and then somewhat average to high conscientiousness. Are we reasonable? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's what I remember too.
Okay. I'll keep that for people. That'll be helpful. Okay. Yeah, and like, would you like me to talk about, say, the problems that I like experience or like things that I thought about from that.
See, like what kind of repetitive sort of problem that you keep running into might be that you can bring up right now with like an example you're willing to discuss or open up a little bit about. And then we could see which of these traits might actually be implicated in how you're coming into those kinds of situations, and then see what's stylistic, and then what kinds of mismatches are actually taking place at the level of trait situation interaction.
Sure. Yeah, one that comes to mind. There might be more, but I don't even have to be specific about it. It's I'll take on big, broad projects, kind of creative or intellectual. Um, but if there are like time constraints or if I have multiple different responsibilities to do, then I will like almost lack the ability to sort of carry through with it. Or become stressed and sort of spirals of stress of like, oh, I've taken on this huge responsibility. I want to have an amazing idea. I want to have intricate plans about what my for example, I'll just say like my dissertation, say for example university, or other projects I've done, say writing or things like this, and then I'm like, oh wait, maybe I'm not actually capable of doing this. And it's interesting because sometimes actually if I have enough time, actually these big plans actually they can pull through the way I want it, but if I'm under time pressure and things, then actually they fall under my expectations. I don't know if that would be something that's helpful.
Can you tell me a little more about the time factor? Like,
Yeah.
is it to have more time versus to feel time limited?
I would say this. When I've done some projects where I've had like really ambitious plans, but then if I actually pull through, it's because I just basically I thought it would take less time than I thought it actually did. But if there was no real time limit, then I'm like, oh fine, it just takes another couple of weeks to do it, but then I'll do it to the degree I want to do it. But if so it's somewhat like it's almost a misjudgment of how long something will take, something like that.
Can you do me a favor, Jack? Are you able to pull up the scores on the screen, and then
Yeah. Do that now.
I'm looking at them right now, and there are points of connection that I'm already seeing actually that I'd like to point.
Sure. I mean, I'll pull them up for people on the channel, and I have them up here myself. So yeah.
Okay, amazing. So look at your here. One sec. Here we are. Okay, look at your extroversion scores. So extroversions, it's more tilted toward the introverted end of the spectrum. So if you look at the facet level scores, what you see is very high activity level. So you do a lot. You're like in. Assertiveness is the next highest facet, which is about wanting. So when you see you want them. That's part of your extroversion experience. Liking, which is the kick that somebody gets out of getting what they want once they've gotten it. Liking is sort of the rest of what you see there, which is comparatively lower. And so you want things more than you actually like them when you get them. So it's like you see things that grip you, and that initiates a process, but the kick that you get out of it isn't out of actually getting your hands on them and consuming them. Let's say it's something else. So that's what I'm reading when I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Does that resonate?
That's a very helpful insight. That seems too true. Yeah, like again, I mean, yeah, like again, I mean, I guess something as well. Just I guess I've been thinking almost like precisely that in terms of like whether if I say start a song on guitar or I start a project, if my the highest ambition of my plan, I don't see that is going to be carried through. I'm like, well, what's the point of continuing the project? And so, for example, if I'm time limited, I'll be like, oh, well, now I have to do it. Oh no, well, this is not even living up to my expectations anyway. Maybe I should have just done something simpler because this is not gonna. Whereas, but if I have enough time, I'll just keep redoing it until I'm like, oh yeah, this is as cool as I thought it would be, something like that.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Let's go through the other domains as well, and you keep telling me if it fits or not, and then we'll bring it all together in the end and make sense of this pattern that you noted. All right. So next up is agreeableness. So the overall measure is also around the same as your extroversion. It's 35, so it's toward the disagreeable end, though it's in the normal range, so to speak, statistically normal, I mean, not like good or bad normal.
Right.
So trust is the highest. Sorry, sympathy is the highest. So morality, which is
Yeah.
I forget what that was. Do you have the definitions?
I think I do.
Yeah, I got it too.
Okay.
So high scores on this scale see no need for pretense or manipulation when dealing with others and are therefore candid, frank, and sincere. So this is politeness. It's like an aspect of politeness.
So if lower morality is like low politeness, is that right?
Low morality is, yeah, lower polite. So you're less concerned with smoothing things over so as not to offend people. Sorry, it's the other way around. So you're you're tactful, generally speaking, with how you phrase your thoughts and intentions, so that there's a relative sense of peace around, basically.
Right.
Yeah. That
makes sense? Yeah.
Cooperation. So that's compliance. That is here. Let me get the definition back out. So individuals who score high on this scale dislike confrontations. Those who score low are more likely to intimidate others to get their way. So you are based on this, what I read, it's that you care about other people. There's a kind of compassionate, sympathetic way of looking and treating others, but you're not afraid of conflict should push come to shove. And you have a general sense of trusting or feeling that what you see is what you get, that people don't have, generally speaking, ulterior motives, or there's a kind of suspiciousness that you don't tend to fall into when approaching others.
I think something I could say is on this is that in the terms of the high sympathy, I think it's, I mean, I don't know what to make of maybe the interaction with the other parts of that trait, but I feel like often I'm like, oh, I care a lot about other people, or I will it'll make me do things like I'll give up my time to do something for someone else, but then I'm like, wait, I have other things to do for myself too, so I can get kind of sucked into that. Yeah, that.
Yeah, interesting. So we could move on for now. And
Sure.
as you can tell, the interpretation process itself is very iterative.
Yeah.
Hop back and forth and to see how the bigger picture forms from looking at the parts.
Sure.
So our working memory is very important in this process, just to keep it all and hold it together. Next, we've got conscientiousness, which is toward the higher end, though also within relatively the normal range. And you have, let's see, you like to think through things a lot and to make sure that all the proper steps are in order, that you're not about to make a mistake. You like to double check, in other words. You are able to, so self-discipline, that was, what was the willpower? Okay. So this is essentially
ability to push.
Yeah, the push and sustaining that output, that level of output across time. It's like this is a part of industriousness, by the way.
Oh, right.
Achievement striving, dutifulness. Hold on, what's dutifulness? And this is, by the way, where like the definitions themselves are very important, because like I don't know them by heart, but you read the definition and then you see if that category notion actually fits with your experience.
It says it's the strength of a person's sense of duty and obligation, need to do something. Yeah, I mean, it says it's somewhat low. I mean, I think it's something like I like to do things in the long term and stuff, but then sometimes if there are things that I like have to do maybe for other people or like for myself, I'm like, maybe there's something more interesting, something like that I kind of have a tendency to do.
If I'm wondering if like if something is seen as a duty that you have to fulfill, kind of like from an extrinsic motivation standpoint, then
It's not very motivating. Yeah.
it's not as motivating as if it's something that you personally want and are intrinsically motivated by. And when you approach tasks, it's not this isn't a very, like the achievement striving bit, which is at the 35th percentile, basically says that a big motivator for you isn't like the kick you get from like doing super well and like it's not power driven in a sense. You're not image driven in a sense. You don't do it to appear well. That's not a big part of why you do what you do.
I see. Would it be reasonable to say it's something like more of the process of doing it, or just that the fact that you're going towards something rather than actually achieving it?
I think so. That's probably a fair interpretation to make there, if that fits, especially with how you're seeing yourself.
Yeah, I mean, and if I bring it back to the things we talked about, like in terms of for example, extroversion, yeah, I agree. It kind of constellates together in the sense that like I can work really hard at things, especially things that I've intrinsically decided to do that I like doing. But again, maybe it's sometimes hard to actually follow through, or I can or other things that are like that are not as motivating can actually become very attentionally draining if I don't want to do them, something like that, so they're not as rewarding.
Yeah, which brings us to the neuroticism domain, actually, because I imagine, so neuroticism is toward the higher end, which means that when things don't go your way or when you see trouble brewing, you either tend to get anxious or freeze, not knowing what to do, and doubt yourself and your capacity to move forward through the goal. You're less likely, like anger and depressiveness and immoderation are less salient features of your neuroticism when it finds expression. That's how
It's more personal freezing and just sort of like a bit, yeah, anxiety. I mean, they says the trait anxiety. Yeah, that would make more sense. Yeah, I wouldn't really get angry with someone, or it's just more of an internal sort of receding into myself. Yeah, interesting. And again, I think again I don't want to like press the point further, but again, it makes sense why like if I was under time pressure or stress and things that could, in conjunction with say extroversion and conscientiousness, mean that it's kind of difficult to get things done.
So were you saying that it's like time is a very important factor here? That like
Not necessarily time. It's actually it's more the felt stress first, but that can be induced because you have, it's more like a responsibility actually, less than time, something like that. It's more that something has to be done, say for someone else, or for like myself. I'm responsible to myself or something like that. Yeah.
So can you give an example actually in as concrete terms as you're willing or able,
Sure.
of when this pattern you're talking about didn't play out and what was different about it?
When it didn't.
Yeah, when it didn't.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
you would have expected it to, but for some reason it actually didn't, and the outcome was different.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, for example, like starting this podcast, it was quite difficult, and there, for example, many things to like have to do to get it started. But I didn't. It was, since it was on my own terms, I didn't mind if it took a while to say get things set up to equipment or something, or ask people to do it, or learn how to do it well. I could actually just sort of take the opportunities in my stride. And if I mess it up or wasn't as good as I want it to be, I can just make another one kind of instantly, and go again. Things like this. So it's not actually, it's not, it makes me think that sometimes in other scenarios, it's almost like two one shot of like, well, yeah, like, I would like almost more opportunity or more flexibility in a way.
So part of, I think, what I'm hearing about the opportunity flexibility thing is that, like, I'm wondering if the agreeableness tension actually comes about where I imagine with these scores, maybe a tension you experience sometimes is when you feel like you want something that might require relying or depending on others for. And if others are implicated, then you simultaneously don't want to trouble them. You don't want to burden them. But at the same time, um, um, you'd rather let go than to
Yeah.
going and hold them in and enlist them to like.
That's such a helpful insight. Yeah, because yeah, on many projects I'm like, oh, there's a fight, there's like this important piece, but I'm like, I don't wanna ask someone for that. I feel that's rude, or it's just a bother, and that can give kind of anxiety of like, now I have to actually start talking to someone to finish this project. This is a whole lot more annoying. Yeah.
Look at where that takes us then. It's that in contexts where what you're able to do, what you're wanting to do, you're able to do without having to rely on others, you're less likely to encounter this trouble because you can
Yeah.
manage it on your own. But in contexts where the problem you're trying to solve might actually require, again, in like cog sci terms, distributed cognition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having a team and being able to rely and depend on others to solve or to help you solve, then this tension might actually arise.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, for example, my dissertation, I was like, there'll be times where I'm like, well, I have no idea what to do because it's only my dissertation supervisor or someone else more knowledgeable than me is going to be able to help me here, and so that puts like wrenches into a flow of getting things done. Whereas say a
Mhm.
podcast, I know I'm talking to someone on a podcast, but in terms of actually setting it up or doing it or writing my own essays or whatnot, I can just do it myself. So yeah, that's actually a helpful insight. Um,
Yeah, I'm also wondering about like, so look, openness is quite high as well.
mhm.
Now, high neuroticism and high openness coupled with low extroversion basically means that when things don't go your way and you're faced with the problem, you're more likely to dwell on and ruminate on all the things that might go wrong rather than all the opportunities that are there for the taking.
Mm-hmm.
And low agreeableness also means that you're less likely to rely and depend on others. You're more your world is more
Mm-hmm.
solitary world than a world of collectives and relationships and
Mm-hmm.
interdependence, stuff like that. And you're conscientious, relatively speaking. And so like
Mm-hmm.
want to do work, you'd rather not depend on others to do work, and you want to you care about not messing up, and you are considerate and imaginative
Mm-hmm.
and like thoughtful in how you move about your problems. Sometimes at the risk of getting hung up on and ruminating on all the things that might go wrong instead of also some of the things that might go right, and how much you like. I wonder if
Mm-hmm.
you deliberately gave yourself an extra moment to dwell on the feeling you get when you've gotten what you want, if that might give you a better chance to enjoy it and appreciate it. So
Mm-hmm.
bring your liking up to the same level as your wanting.
It's interesting you say that. I've been thinking about that of like things that I should be proud of this or that, but instead I'll just instantly start doing something else, something
Mm.
new. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, yeah, it's again, it's funny because my spidey senses were tingling when you were asking me to think about, oh, what are the combination of different things, and like I can imagine there's something, and it's surprising how well this fits. Do you find that when you do it with many different clients, there are perennial problems that you see, and it's somehow it seems that like for a lot of people actually the traits are this important to consider how people are, or is it always important to see people's traits, or like, does this make sense? I guess it'd be a really nice transition to like more generally like how we think about like culture and population levels, and yeah.
Yeah, perennial problems in particular trait measures or types, or perennial
Um,
problems.
just just for
Yeah.
people, I mean, one question is just like for example, I've noticed that wow, it makes a lot of sense that the problems I face are inherently relevant to my trait scores. But do some people go, actually, no, it wasn't that relevant? Or do you find it's always kind of relevant?
I'll be modest when I say this. Hardly anyone has found issues with this approach in my experience so far. And most people have really found it resonating and allowing them to sort of see themselves and their life context at like a higher level, like bird's eye view almost, to understand, again, not like what's happening at the level of the particulars, but how to make sense of that in light of one's general needs from the point of view of their personality, because there are certain contexts where this profile is going to be very well suited for, such as, again, being able to solve problems that don't require other, like in your case, that won't require you to face the problem of like enlisting others and having to on others and whatnot, where there will be like an intellectual kind of kick that you'll get out of it. It'll be a way for your openness to find life and expression. There's an aesthetic joy that you get out of that. And projects that aren't just like day to day, but they have a lifespan that's longer than that, maybe long or year-long projects, and where you will be careful not to make errors along the way, and you'll be cautious, too concerned and impulsive when you see something that you like come along the way. That's another thing that I see here, that there's not a lot of impulsiveness from the goal pursuit side of things.
There's not a lot.
Yeah, not a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of very planned.
Like you're not a puppy that will just chase anything that it sees, like, in front of
Yeah. It's kind of the opposite, and that can also sometimes be a bad thing, because I'm like, oh well, actually that thing actually looks pretty cool. Maybe I should do that. But I'm like, but I have all these other projects, and if I to put less time into them, then those month-long goals are going to somehow, they're not going to fall through. Well, this is interesting. I know you might be running out of time. I mean, a couple more questions would be like, because even doing the test, I was being like, oh, I think I'm like this, but I wonder, I'm like, I wish I wanted to be, I want to be more like this trait, higher in agreeableness or whatever. And so, and there's like almost like sometimes I don't want to actually, I'm like, I don't want to put that when on the test, because I'm like, what if I want to aspire to something? So my question is, should one want to change traits? Like, if someone's low in agreeableness, might one want to try and actually maybe say, well, look, actually, it would be benefit from greater social exposure or whatever, or asking more people about things. So maybe you should try and do that more often.
You know what, Jack? Like, I think that's a great and very pertinent question, which also comes up in the context of psychotherapy, because a lot of the times what people come into the therapy room with are either implicit or very explicit judgments and critical attitudes toward their own selves. And it's like, I just feel guilt over or about the way I am as a kind of person, let's say. And there's something that Carl Rogers, basically one of the spearheads of humanistic psychotherapy, said. He called it the paradoxical theory of change. The quote was something like, it's funny, but I find that it's only once I've come to accept myself as I actually am that I can then allow myself to change. And so I try to bring that same spirit, the humanistic spirit of acceptance, into this process, whereby the first question I ask isn't how this is problematic for you, but when has this solved problems for you? When is it useful? Tell me. When have you found that this has actually saved you? In what contexts? And then that really pulls in a certain kind of engagement with what you're otherwise critical of and rejecting of, that allows you to see its value, which is very much still context dependent, right? But its value nevertheless. And then we can think about when it hasn't served you well. So that's
That's interesting. That was interesting, because then it makes you think of the trade-offs, and it's something that I was just literally just listening to John Vervaeke and Bernardo Castro talk about, of like any positive attribute you have might have a negative attribute, and you can even be confused. And they're talking about I'm so stubborn, it's not a good thing, but then oh, but I never give up. as a positive side of that. So it's like so it's like you're not realizing that the stubbornness and the perseverance are kind of the same thing. I mean, it makes me think maybe if I'm more averse to contacting people like social situations, or like I'm sympathetic, but but I'm low in like extroversion. That might be a good thing because then it's made me sufficient in many ways, or like or it means I don't need to contact people because I've learned how to build a wide capacity of different skills. So, mhm.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
okay,
Go ahead, please.
interesting. No, yeah. So that's no, it's a really helpful answer to thinking about should one change traits. But I'm also wondering, one question is about developing ways of adapting to your traits set. One thing like John Peterson, or he constantly says, is he says, I'm really high in agreeableness, and that's why I always pick fights with people and get conflict out the way. And it sometimes sounds paradoxical. Like, what is he on about? Like, he's not. You could say, like, is he not? He's not agreeable, or it just sounds like he wants to pick up arguments. I would say something on that. Maybe you have something to say on that. Because to me, it's interesting because it would be like, I actually want to get the conflict over with because I know I'm agreeable, and therefore if I don't get it out the way now, never I'm not gonna bring it up again, and it's gonna, like, I know it's going to hurt me. And so in that way, it seems to me like Jordan Peterson in that sense has like grown a kind of character trait to compensate for his personality traits. So I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, I'm so I understand the question, and I think my stance on that sort of thing is that there is no one size fits all solution that I could
Hmm.
allow myself to uh, sort of propose while staying honest to
Hmm.
myself. Only because I think the thing that I value most is the right to autonomy and rationality. And this goes to one of the questions that you included in your list of questions in your email to me earlier on
Hmm.
for today, which was about how psychotherapy is not about giving advice. Like,
Hmm.
all my process is about, um, it's never your judgment as the patient versus my judgment as the therapist, and I'm the expert, and I am an
Hmm.
I'm in some sense an epistemic authority. Um, that's like what I trained for, obviously, but the
Hmm.
existential encounter itself is not between you and me, but through me, it's you
Hmm.
against your own conscience. And all I do is reflect and try to mirror back to you aspects of your situation that might allow you to better understand what's been going on for you.
Hmm.
That if it puts you in enough of a state of cognitive dissonance that it feels like you're being complicit in your own suffering now that you know this extra piece of information.
Hmm.
No choice whether to continue as you have done or to try to do something different. I'm just here to
Yeah,
put that back to you, but that's
that's very
that's
interesting.
your birthright. Like, your suffering is your birthright. Your meaning making is also your birthright. And your decision, your right to choice, your freedom of will, that's also your birthright. And
Hmm.
so I couldn't, generally, in a kind of heuristic fashion, there might be rules of thumb like the ones that Peterson is uh,
Hmm.
expressing, in those contexts that work more often than not, let's say. But I'm very individualized with.
That's helpful. So there's no algorithmic solutions here, but would you kind of be affirmative that there can be character developments on top of traits that in a way kind of invert them in some sense? That could kind of be the
Very
case.
much so. Yep.
Interesting. You might be out of time. Is there anything you want to do in terms of like looking at the? We might be out of time, but in terms of the population level, would you like to like quickly touch on the way in which this in ways like the almost population levels are adapted to? Because one question I had was, even like, say I'm high in like openness, high in conscientiousness, and low in extroversion, like is that something that many people would have? Is that like, are there like constellations that you talked about, a lawyer? Does that make sense? Then might there be traits that are correlated, that people come with sets of them? And yeah.
Yeah, I think this is. Give me just a moment to dwell with this, because this is
Sure.
actually like a really complex question as I see it, and to honor that complexity, I would need much more time and like reflection.
Yeah, sure. Don't worry.
But I want to see what I can say and what I can think about.
Yeah, sure.
So one of the things we know is that cross-culturally, the 5 major trait dimensions more or less apply, even though there's some difficulty in replicating some of these traits. I think openness was one of them, and anyway, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
But there are cultural differences in the general like mean of the in some of these traits at the level of the population. In other words, some cultures seem to promote extroversion and conscientiousness more than neuroticism or agreeableness.
Mm-hmm.
And we can think of the difference between like collectivistic versus individualistic cultures as reflecting just that sort of variance along agreeableness and conscientiousness in some sense. I think the idea here is that, so this is the best I can do right now, I feel like, but we often get into this sort of rhetoric and narrative impasse actually around like cultural differences as reflecting values that are and ought to be relative from context to context, and that are in some sense not what's the word, that should not be subjected to like critical scrutiny or reflection or criticism of any sort. That you've got your point of view that presupposes your cultural context, and I've got mine, and no culture is better than any other culture. I don't think that's quite the case, actually. When I think about it in an activist way, the reason for that is that if what's at the very bottom of this is opponent processes and trade-offs and relevance realization and optimization, which is itself a context-specific process, and what then matters is the grip between the embodied self and the worldly context in which it's situated, then cultural differences seem to reflect stylistic differences in the kinds of grip that are promoted and seen as adaptive from at the level of populations from context to context, which all these cultural bubbles, let's say, entities, let's say, whatever you want to call it, they presuppose and carry and gather their own histories, their own courses of history, if that makes sense, where some things proved to be adaptive in in enough contexts over enough time that just became the general norm for optimization, which is to say 2 things, actually. One, that way of being has been solving problems. It's been a form of problem solving because it's been a form of optimization. And 2, that there is no such thing as optimization except as in relation to the contextual demands themselves. And so there's a sense in which the problem solving value of cultural values themselves has to be acknowledged and in some sense respected, while at the same time the possibility of criticizing these things also has to be preserved, because you want things to be both context sensitive, right, and cross-contextual in some sense.
Yeah.
And meta values at play, as I see it, that these individual differences at the level of populations might actually reflect.
Let's see. That's a helpful answer. And again, we'll close it up. But one thing that makes me think of is like in our world today, you could argue that, like, for example, the trait conscientiousness is almost valued like highly than other. I mean, you can feel free to like go against this, but in some ways, like if our world has been more stable for a long time, you could argue maybe there's like pressure, people that aren't really conscientious, so they like, for example, do less well in our workplace. And so that's one interesting thing to point out. But again, also you might say, okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that conscientiousness overall is like de facto good or beneficial. Because it always depends on context, and then even our world context could change, right? Like on an individual level and on like a cultural level. So we'd have to be careful to think about like sort of normative judgments about say a trait like that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. No, I think we've covered a lot. And it's been helpful for me, and I hope for other people too.
I
Yeah,
hope
awesome.
so. This was fun for me. So thanks for reaching out and initiating this.
Sure.
I hope it's meaningful for you as well. And
Yeah.
it's a great project to have a podcast like this where you get to uh, allocate space and time in the context of your life to explore your openness, which
Hmm.
you really have, and
Right, right.
get a kick out of that. So,
Thanks, Guy, very much. Is a specific place people can find you? I know you have your own podcast.
uh, yeah, I
I'll put
will. My podcast actually, so it's actually been on hiatus. I don't know what the
right.
resurrect,
Yeah,
but it's we had 10 episodes. I'll be happy to share a link for that.
sure.
Also,
I can get that. Yeah, I'll put that in the description for people. Yeah,
sure. I'll also share my academia
sure.
URL with you where people can find my
Sure.
scholarly contributions. So,
Okay, awesome.
okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much.